The C8 Corvette is an amazing car, but with so many different models, trims, and variants, I think the language that surrounds this car can be a little bit confusing. Like, just offhand, you have the Z06, the Z07, the ZR1, the 1LZ, the E-Ray, the Stingray, and the Zora. Not to mention, there's also a variety of powertrains like the LT2, the LT5, and the LT6. But when we put this all in context and maybe compare it to some other vehicles like the Porsche 911, I think the Corvette lineup is actually pretty straightforward. So that is what we are going to talk about today. Whether you are in the market for a new Corvette or you're just curious, here is a full guide to all of the different versions of the 2025 Chevrolet Corvette. Now, before we dive into any of the specifics, I want to just kind of talk about at a high level where the C8 kind of finds its place in the market. The current Corvette that is on sale today is the C8. It is the 8th generation of the Corvette, and it came out back in 2020. And the C8 was a massive departure from prior generations of the Corvette for a few different reasons. For one, it was the first production Corvette to feature a mid-engine layout, which is really important because the mid-engine layout has pretty much become the predominant format for any serious performance car. And it's also huge because this is something that GM has been talking about doing, making a mid-engine Corvette, since literally like the 1970s. Another big change was the transmission, where all prior generations of the Corvette were either equipped with a manual transmission or a torque converter automatic. The C8 is only available with a dual clutch auto. And again, this just puts the C8 in line with the supercar market more broadly. And the last big change that was brought about with this generation was the powertrain. The C8 was the first Corvette to be offered with all-wheel drive, with a turbocharged engine, with a hybrid powertrain, and much more. What all of this ends up resulting in is that the C8 Corvette is kind of no longer a car that you have to make excuses for. It uses a lot of the same technology and has a lot of the same features as some of the finest offerings from Italy, but comes in at a fraction of the price. So to kick us off, as we kind of walk through the C8 lineup, the first version that we will talk about is the Corvette Stingray. This was the first model introduced in the C8 lineage, and you can think of the Stingray as essentially being the base model Corvette. Now, we are going to talk about prices here, but keep in mind that automakers are always adjusting their prices. So this information is going to be current kind of as of the end of 2024, but if you're watching this video somewhere in the future, this should still give you an idea of kind of the differential in price between some of the different models, but the exact number might be a little bit off. So the absolute cheapest way that you are going to be able to get into a new C8 Corvette is going to be with a 1LZ Coupe Stingray that comes in just under $70,000 before any add-ons, tax, or destination charges. And since I just mentioned coupe, you might be able to infer from that the Stingray is also offered as a convertible. The convertible has about a $7,000 higher base price compared to the coupe, so it comes in right around $77,000. Now, the next big thing that you'll need to take into account when looking at the Stingray is the trim level. And good news, these trim levels are consistent across the Corvette lineup, and they are the 1LZ, the 2LZ, and the 3LZ. With the 1LZ being the most basic option, the 2LZ kind of being the intermediary, and the 3LZ having the most standard equipment. Now, I'm not going to dive into all of the super specifics here because it would kind of be a little bit boring. I'd basically just be reading them off of a list. But to get a general sense, the 1LZ is still a $70,000 car, so it does still have some standard equipment, like a high-quality sound system, an HD backup camera, and power seats. When you upgrade to the 2LZ, you're going to get things like an even better sound system, additional driver aid / safety features, and what is maybe the coolest feature is a performance video and data recorder. But all of this does come at a cost, with the 2LZ getting a price bump of around $7,000. And with the 3LZ, you're getting things like even better performance bucket seats, and some nicer touches on the interior. And this comes with a smaller price bump of around $4,000. Next up, let's talk about engines. As I mentioned in the intro, the C8 Corvette was a big leap forward for a variety of reasons, and one of those reasons is the powertrain. But that is really more so the case for some of the higher end cars. When we're talking about the Stingray, they are all equipped with the same engine. A 6.2 liter pushrod V8 that makes around 495 horsepower and is called the LT2. This pushrod V8 technology is literally a design that GM has been refining since like the 1950s. It is an extremely effective, powerful, durable, reliable engine. The strike against it is it might lack some of the drama and flair of the powertrains that are found in the Corvette's competition. Now, as we look through some of the other options that are available for this car, of course, there are going to be things like color, interior materials, but by far and away, the most important option is the Z51 package. It costs around $6,500 and in my opinion is one of the best bargains for a performance package in the entire automotive industry. You are getting things like an upgraded differential, better cooling, more optimal gear ratios for performance driving, a sport exhaust, and more. For anyone who thinks they might bring their Stingray to the racetrack, the Z51 package is absolutely essential. Now, to zoom us back out, the Stingray is intended to be the entry level, the base model Corvette. It is still relatively pricey and offers a high level of performance, but is going to be far more attainable and drivable than some of the other models that we are about to talk about. So we're gonna move on here to the next model in the Corvette lineup in terms of price and talk about the E-Ray. And just like the Stingray, the E-Ray is available as both a coupe and a convertible, with the coupe starting at $106,000 and the convertible starting at $113,000. The E-Ray also uses the same 6.2 liter LT2 V8 that is found in the Stingray, but the trick is that it adds an electric motor up front. This adds an additional 160 horsepower to the car to bump total output to 655 horsepower. This also makes the E-Ray the first all-wheel drive Corvette, the first hybrid Corvette, and the first front-wheel drive Corvette, seeing as it can be driven in electric-only mode. Of course, adding this electric motor and small battery does have a toll on weight, with the E-Ray weighing about 400 pounds more than the Stingray. Now, to accommodate that extra power, the E-Ray gets the wide body of the Corvette Z06. Meaning that it has more grip, better brakes, and more aggressive aero. And additionally, this is something that helps differentiate the E-Ray from the base model Stingray. As for the trim levels, it will follow the same basic structure as all of the other Corvettes and has relatively comparable price differentials to the Stingray, with the 1LZ starting at $106,000, the 2LZs starting at $112,000, and the 3LZs starting at $117,000. And again, there are bountiful options to choose from in terms of color and interior materials, but there really is no special performance package for the E-Ray in the same way that there is for the Stingray or the Z06. Now, to zoom back out, what the E-Ray is GM's attempt to dip their toe into the world of performance hybrids. Much of the Corvette's competition from brands like Porsche, McLaren, Lamborghini, or Ferrari, these companies all have their own version of hybrid supercars. So the E-Ray, while it might not fully compete with them, is GM's way of trying to feel out this segment of the market. And in terms of how this hybrid system is actually implemented in the E-Ray, just strapping an electric motor to the front axle, it's a little bit more of a rudimentary way of implementing this type of system, opposed to putting an electric motor in between the engine and the transmission or using it to spool turbos. Basically, the E-Ray is meant to be kind of the hyped up daily driver version of the Corvette. If we were gonna make an analogy between the Corvette and the Porsche 911, The Stingray is like the Carrera. Both are entry-level models. The E-Ray is more equivalent to something like the 911 Turbo, where it is intended to be used every day and has lots of creature comforts and luxury. Now, next on our list, as we kind of work through this lineup, we are going to talk about the Corvette Z06. Now, the Z06 is relatively comparable to the E-Ray in price, but it could not be more different. While the E-Ray is meant to be the ultimate daily driver, the Z06 is intended to be a full-on track day weapon. And as such, it features a much different powertrain than any of the Corvettes we've talked about so far. The Z06 uses the LT5 engine, which is a 5.5 liter flat plane crank dual overhead cam V8 that makes 670 horsepower. And it's hard to understate just how drastic of a departure the LT5 is from the type of pushrod V8s that GM has been specializing in for the past 70 years. This engine is probably comparable, if not better, to any V8 that has ever come out of Italy. What this ends up meaning in practice is that the LT5 is a drama-filled, passionate engine that requires you to rev it all the way out to redline to reach its full potential. Additionally, to handle all of this extra power, the Z06 is also equipped with a wide body that allows for more grip and additional aero to help complement this additional power. And something you'll often hear online is that with the C8 Z06, GM basically reverse engineered a Ferrari 458, made it even better, and is going to sell it to you for less than half the price. As with all of the other Corvette models that we have discussed so far, the Z06 is offered in 3 different trims: the 1LZ, 2LZ, and 3LZ. And largely there are the same types of options offered between those 3 different trims, but there is a little bit more inflation in terms of the price differential between each of them. With the 1LZ starting at $112,000, the 2LZ starting at $121,000, and the 3LZ starting at $125,000. Of course, you get all of the normal add-ons to choose from, but what is unique to the Z06 is the Z07 package. This is an additional performance package that adds a whole bunch of goodies to the car, including even more aggressive aero, upgraded brakes, and super sticky tires. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the intent of the Z06 is to be used full tilt on the racetrack, providing the highest levels of driver engagement, excitement, and performance. And to circle back to our Porsche 911 analogy, the Z06 is basically like the Corvette version of the 911 GT3 or GT3 RS. Both are cars with naturally aspirated, high revving engines that you need a racetrack to reach their full potential. Next up in our Corvette lineup, there is the latest addition, the ZR1. Now, full transparency, right now in kind of late 2024, the ZR1 is not on sale yet. It hasn't been fully released, so we don't have things like official pricing, but there is quite a bit that we do know about this car. Certainly, the eye-catching headline here is the ZR1's powertrain. It uses a twin turbocharged version of that LT5 from the Z06, and adding on those turbos, it raises total power to 1,064 horsepower. That means that the ZR1 is not only the most powerful version of the Corvette ever made, but it is the most powerful mass production car that GM has ever built. And nowadays, it really isn't all that uncommon to see new supercars crossing the 1,000 horsepower mark. But what is unique about the ZR1 is that all 1,064 horsepower is coming from the engine. There is no hybrid system here. There's no electric motors helping out. It is just a big twin turbo V8 sending all of that horsepower to the rear wheels. And despite those crazy stats, the ZR1 will be offered in the same basic format as all of the other Corvettes, as both a coupe and a convertible, and with the same 1 through 3 LZ trim packages. But the biggest open-ended question with the ZR1 is going to be price. We really can only speculate at this point, but a good educated guess would tell us that a 1LZ ZR1 is likely to start around $180,000, a 2LZ in the neighborhood of $190,000, and I would not be surprised to see a 3LZ ZR1 coming in right around the $200,000 mark. And to circle back around to our Porsche 911 analogy, the ZR1's equivalent would be the GT2 RS, a car that is full tilt towards performance and has levels that you cannot even come reasonably close to reaching on the street. And I'm gonna make one last point here and make a little prediction that when the ZR1 comes out, it will break just about every single production car lap record at every racetrack it visits. Now, honestly, we would be perfectly fine to end things there. For most automakers, that would be a well-rounded lineup for your sports car, but GM actually has something else up their sleeve with the C8. There are some very credible rumors that GM is working on an even more outlandish version of the Corvette, the Zora. The Zora name harkens back to an engineer who was one of the biggest advocates for switching the Corvette to a mid-engine layout. Now, we have no official confirmation from GM yet that the Zora is even real, but let me tell you what is being speculated. Basically, with the Zora, people are thinking that GM is going to take that twin turbocharged 5.5 liter V8 from the ZR1 and then add the electric motor from the E-Ray to the front of the car. This would be truly an insane vehicle with power figures that we would have to imagine you're talking about 1,200, maybe even 1,300 horsepower. Likely this would be accompanied by some very aggressive aerodynamics and likely some of the best brakes that have ever been put on a production car to handle all of that extra power. But again, we are working with very limited information here. If these rumors end up being true, I would expect the Zora to start somewhere in the mid $200,000 range, but with options, I would not be surprised to see the Zora pushing the $300,000 mark. And if it does eventually come out, I would imagine that the Zora will kind of be the swan song for the internal combustion engine Corvette. So just to tie everything together here, that is the Corvette lineup for 2025 and maybe a little bit beyond. We have 4 different models: the entry-level Stingray, the performance hybrid E-Ray, the engagement and track-focused Z06, and the hypercar fighter ZR1. All of these cars are available as both coupes and convertibles, and their trim levels range from the 1LZ to the 3LZ. The C8 Corvette is truly a really big leap forward for GM, and we can only hope that GM continues to push the envelope with the C8 well into the future.